This video is a quick refresher on how to factor quadratics, or to solve quadratic equations by factoring, I guess I should say. So the first 4 questions that you'll see on your worksheet are already factored for you. They're factored into binomials. You see them in parentheses here. So if you want to solve this, in order for 3n minus 2 times 4n plus 1 to equal 0, then one of these 2 binomials in the parentheses has to equal 0. So what we do is we just set each one equal to 0. So we say 3n minus 2 equals 0, and we say 4n plus 1 equals 0. We just solve each one of those. So here we would add 2 to both sides. We get 3n equals 2. We divide by 3 and divide by 3 here. So n equals 2/3. Over here we would subtract our 1. 4n equals negative 1. Divide by 4. n equals negative 1/4. So our 2 answers are negative 1/4 and positive 2/3. A lot of quadratics are going to have 2 answers. So remember that as you go through these problems. Now, whenever you get down here to equations like number 5, 6, 7, 8, these are not factored for you. So let's do number 6 first. The first thing you want to do here is you want to move everything to one side, because what we just did in number 1 does not work unless the equation is equal to 0. I suggest that you always make sure that your n squared is positive. So on number 6, even though it means that I'm going to have to move 2 terms instead of just 1, I'm going to move the negative 18 and the negative 9 over to the left-hand side. So we'll have n squared plus 9n plus 18 equals 0. So notice as you move these over to the other side that they change signs. Also notice that I wrote these in descending order. You have your n squared first, your n term next, and then your constant term last. So to factor, what we're going to do is we're going to think of what we would need to multiply to get our first term here. So our first term is n squared, and the only 2 things we can multiply to get n squared are n and n, are the only ones that will work here. So n and n will go into our parentheses. For our last term, we get a positive 18, and to get a positive 18, we could multiply 2 times 9. We could multiply 3 times 6. We could multiply 1 times 18. We also could multiply negative 2 times negative 9. We could multiply negative 3 times negative 6. We could multiply negative 1 times negative 18. So those are all possibilities to put in the second part of our parentheses here. In this case, I am not going to use any of these negatives because I see in my equation that I don't have any negatives. This middle term right here is not negative, so I'm not going to use these negatives in this case. I'm going to look at these numbers. I see that these all multiply to give me 18. I need them to add or subtract to give me 9. So if I look at my options here, 3 plus 6 is going to give me 9. So I'm going to try plus 3 plus 6. And you always want to check your work. The first term should work. N times n should give you n squared. 3 times 6 should give you 18. But then you also want to check your inner terms, 3n, and your outer terms, 6n. When you add those together, you get 9n. So we see that that does in fact match the 9n that we had up here. So we now have this factored. Now we're still not quite done because we need to find the answers to this problem. We need to find the numbers that make this true. So we'll say n plus 3 equals 0 and n plus 6 equals 0. So I would subtract 3 here. N equals negative 3. And right here, I'll subtract the 6. N equals negative 6. So my 2 answers for this problem are negative 6 and negative 3. Now these problems can be a little bit more difficult whenever you have coefficients in front of your y squared or x squared or whatever v squared here in this problem. So if we look at number 7, the first thing we always want to do is move everything to one side. So I would have 7v squared plus 35v plus 40, minus 42 equals 0. That 35 changes signs whenever we move it over here to the left-hand side. 42 does not, so it stays negative 42. As I look at these numbers, I see that they are all divisible by 7. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to factor out a greatest common factor. So I'm going to pull a 7 out of the parentheses, and I'm going to have v squared plus 5v minus 6 equals 0. So in this case, I was able to factor out that greatest common factor. If I multiplied that 7 back, I would get 7v squared plus 35v minus 42. So it is helpful to factor out that greatest common factor. It gives you smaller numbers to factor with. So now as I look at this here, I see that I have a v squared as my first term of this quadratic, so I know that that will give me a v and a v here. My last term is the negative 6, so I could use negative 2 times positive 3, or I could use positive 2 and negative 3. I could also use negative 1 times 6, or positive 1 times negative 6. So as I look at those, I can see that the negative 1 and the positive 6 would give me a positive 5 in the middle. So if I choose negative 1 and positive 6, then when I check my inner terms, I get negative 1v. When I check my outer terms, I get 6v. And add those together, I would get 5v, which is what I have up here. So to solve, I'm going to set each one of these equal to 0. My greatest common factor is out here. I'm going to set it equal to 0, but it's not going to give me an answer because there's no variable involved with that. Sometimes there's a variable in the greatest common factor. Then I set v minus 1 equal to 0, which is going to give me v equals 1 whenever I solve it. And then I'm going to set v plus 6 equal to 0, which is going to give me v equals negative 6 whenever I solve that. So I get 1 and negative 6 as my answers for number 7. Let's do one more problem. Let's go back here to the back and let's look at one where we do not have a greatest common factor. So let's look at number 14. So first thing, we'll move everything to one side. We're going to have 3x squared minus 8x minus 16 is going to equal 0. And I do not have a greatest common factor. I cannot divide all three of those by any single number and get, or cannot divide them evenly. So in this case, my first term is 3x squared. So to get 3x squared, I need to multiply 3x times x. So in my parentheses, I know I'm going to have a 3x and an x. Over here for my last term, I have a negative 16. So for negative 16, I could multiply negative 4 and 4. I could multiply negative 2 and 8. I could multiply negative 1 and 16. Those are all options for negative 16. Of course, I could switch where the negative is at as well. These are a little bit more difficult to do because whenever I look, I'm not going to see a pair here that's going to give me negative 8. You have to do a little more guessing and checking with these problems. So I'm just going to pick one to use. So perhaps negative 2, positive 8. So whenever I check to see if that works, I get negative 2x for my inner terms. I get 24x for my outer terms, which gives me 22x. So I see that does not match the 8x that I need in the middle, so I need to try something else. Before I give up on this 2 and 8, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch where they're at. I'm going to put the 8 right here, and the 2 right here. Sometimes that will work for you. In this case, I'll get negative 8x. I will get a positive 6x, and that is going to give me negative 2x. That does not give us negative 8x like we need in the middle here. So negative 2 and 8 does not work. So we're going to try again. And this time, I think I'll try the negative 4 and the positive 4. So I'm going to have negative 4 and positive 4 here. So if I check those inner terms, I get negative 4x. If I check the outer terms, I get 12x. If I add them together, I get positive 8x. Now notice, that is not the negative 8x that I need right here, but it is very close. So whenever you get to this point, if you're that close, the only thing that you need to do is change your signs right here. So if I make this a 3x plus 4 and an x minus 4, we'll see what happens here. Now when I multiply 4 times x, I get a positive 4x, and 3x times negative 4 gives me a negative 12x. And when I add those together, I get a negative 8x. So I have now factored this correctly. Now, I've not found my answer yet. I do need to set each term, or each binomial equal to 0. So I'll have 3x plus 4 equals 0, and I'll also have x minus 4 equals 0. So over here I'll solve. I'll get 3x equals negative 4. I'll divide by 3. So I get x equals negative 4/3. That's one of my answers. And over here I'm going to add that 4, so I'll get x equals 4. And there is my other answer.